start by introducing Steve Hardy. He's the reserve ranger at the Rahoy Hills Scottish Wildlife Trust. It is Scottish Wildlife Trust, isn't it?
Yeah.
Estate over in Morvern. Morvern, of course, is where we went last summer for a week, a very wet week, which I think you must be getting used to after 25 years there, Steve. And we had and I really enjoyed what the area had to offer. We had a lot of hints from Steve about places to go and look for plants. But Steve is here to talk about the area and how it's developed. He's been living and working there for almost 25 years as the ranger, and so he will know it probably plant by plant. And obviously part of what he does is encourage the spread of the diversity across the reserve and into the wider landscape. It's a landscape that I know I've walked, cycled and kayaked, and last year I botanised there, so I enjoy going there despite the midges and the rain. Keeps the others people away from it. I think that's a good thing about poor weather. So over to you, Steve, and if you just want to give us your contribution at the end of the time, we can have any questions. Just to apologise for my voice. I'm going to mute myself because I'm recovering from a cold, and hopefully I can concentrate for the talk. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you did have a very wet week, if I can remember. It was a very wet summer, actually. So, yeah, just dreadful. Nice spring, very wet summer, but a better autumn. Not too bad so far this winter, but we've had a few storms and a bit of damage. But anyway, so yeah, this is my first online talk, so I hope it goes okay. Audrey's kindly going to put the pictures up as we go along. Hopefully that will work okay. So we'll start with the first one. And the talk will be about looking at the landscape of the reserve, briefly looking at its flora and fauna, talking about how the landscape is now and what our hopes are for the future. I must just firstly point out that I'm not really much of a botanist. I've had to learn the rarer plants that we have on the reserve, particularly the Arctic alpines, but botany is not my speciality. So, but I've got kind of general knowledge about most other wildlife and botany as well. So we'll see how we get on. So, okay, if you want to swap the slides, please. So you probably obviously know where Rahoy is because you came here, but it's the little red circle towards the bottom, just above the word legend in the white square, right down the bottom of the Highland region. It's the second largest of the SWT reserves. The largest is Benmore Coigach, which is much further north. You can see that one to the north above the reserve. So yeah, it's the second largest reserve that the SWT has, and it's kind of special because and known for its biodiversity richness, its variety of habitats. That's what makes Rahoy really quite special. So, okay, we'll go on to the next slide, please. So that's the reserve boundary. You might be able to make out Loch Eriannis in the bottom left of the picture, and the reserve is outlined in red. The hatched areas in red are areas of special areas of conservation. That includes the two mountains and the woodlands, the Atlantic oak woodlands. That's what makes up the SAC parts of the reserve. And the mountains are not only SACs for their Arctic alpines, they're also SACs for their geology, really special geology up there. I think a geologist could give you a fantastic talk all about just the rocks and the landscape of Rahoy, but I'm not a geologist. But yeah, that is certainly a very special feature of those two hills, the geology of those, particularly the basalt. I'll talk about that a bit more. But the whole reserve is a triple SI. The Wildlife Trust owns about a third of it, the northwest corner of it, so half of Benahua and all of Benedon. The rest of the reserve is owned by our Tornish estate, but we have a management agreement with them, so we work closely with them, and that's been going on since, well, the reserve was established in the mid-70s, and SWT have been rangering the reserve and monitoring on it since the mid-80s, and we've had a close working relationship with our Tornish since then, really, and that's ongoing, and it works well, so that's good. Okay, so next slide, please. So we'll look at the landscape first, and we'll start up on the hills. So this is the south cliffs of Benedon. Benedon is one of the two hills on the reserve, the highest of the two. And what makes the hills special, as I said, are the basalt cliffs. That's really what makes them special geologically, but also the basalt is good for the soil because it's very crumbly, and it enriches the soil. And we're often referring to the hills as upside down mountains because they're actually richer. The soil's actually richer higher up than it is lower down. So yeah, we often call them upside down hills. But below the cliffs, we've got another habitat called the species-rich grassland. I've got a better picture of that in a minute, but it's the kind of lighter green grassland around the base of the cliffs, but also sort of sandwiched above the moorland and the granite. You can see the granite, the grayer, lighter granite in front of you in the foreground of this picture. The basalt above and the species-rich grassland is kind of in between the two. But that's a habitat that's kind of been created. It's not always been there, and it's partly to do with the grazing of sheep for many, many centuries, many decades at least, and it's created this species-rich grassland. And when the area had its designations, that was designated as a species-rich grassland. But it's not actually a very natural habitat. It's kind of a gardened habitat, if you like. So I've been told. So, but yeah, that's the uplands, the mountains anyway. Next slide, please. So this is taken from the top of Benedon, and you can see that lighter green sward of the species-rich grassland, sort of sandwiched but below the cliffs and above the moorland and the boggy areas and the heath. And as I say, that's called the species-rich grassland. It is full of flowering plants. It's very rich in flora. And the cliffs obviously have the Arctic alpines, which is what the reserve was established for. John Raven, who is the late husband of Mrs. Raven, who owns our Tornish estate, on which the reserve is, he discovered the Arctic alpines in the 50s, and that's why the reserve was established, initially to protect those communities of Arctic alpine plants. But there's obviously a lot more to the reserve than just the Arctic alpines, but that is a very special part of the reserve. And you can see a lot of the other habitats there. We've got peatland, lochans, and a lot of moorland, obviously. So that's the kind of upland habitat that we have on the reserve. Next one, please. We've got several lochans on the reserve, which are great for breeding birds like greenshank, dunlin, red-throated diver, common sandpiper, waterfowl like teal, mallard, little grebe. So yeah, we've got 6 or 7 lochans. So they're nice to have and they increase our biodiversity. As I say, they're kind of bird hotspots, if you like. So yeah, they're a nice feature of the reserve on the uplands. Next one, please. That's another shot of some of our hillocks. This one's quite a good one because on the islands is a common gull colony, and also on the middle island, or the outermost island in this photo, last year a pair of red-throated divers bred for the first time since the 1990s. They used to breed regularly every year, and there used to be more than the one pair on the reserve. But we think the mink impacted on them. In fact, the mink impacted on a lot of our birds, and there was a lot of declines. I mean, the common gull colony disappeared, but with mink trapping in recent years, the numbers have started to come back. The gull colony has come back, and as I said, the red-throated divers were successful last year, which was wonderful. It was really nice to see that little tiny chick. It was kind of quite a sort of hopeful thing to see, amongst all the trials and struggles that nature is having at the moment. That little chick was quite a hopeful sign. So hopefully they'll come back and breed again. But so that's the hillocks. Next slide, please. So obviously, coming down off the hills and off the moors and from all these lochans, there are many streams, hill streams, and they cascade down into river gorges. And the river gorges are a really special feature of Rahoy Reserve, particularly the Black Glen Gorge. But yeah, it's quite a contrast when you come into these river gorges, because you suddenly come to places where you'll find trees again, whereas on the open hill the trees have gone, but you still find them in these river gorges, and they are remnants really of what used to be across the wider landscape. Next slide, please. So that's inside the Black Glen Gorge. Yeah, just crammed full of mosses and lichens and liverworts and bryophytes and goodness knows what else in there. It's a very rich, special place. That's why it's an SAC. It's got a lot of very, very rare, internationally rare actually, bryophytes that grow down close to the water's edge. A few times the Black Glen Gorge has been eyed up for a hydro scheme because apparently it's absolutely perfect for one. And when streams were being looked at in the 50s for hydro schemes, the Black Glen was highlighted as one of the best in Scotland for one. But because it's such a special place and so sensitive, and it's on a reserve, it's an SAC, it's got all these rare bryophytes in it, it's always been too much for developers to go near, and they've withdrawn from it and said it's just too environmentally sensitive. So, but that's people, they still keep eyeing it up and they still keep talking about it, and it's on the back shelf, if you like. It hasn't been completely written off. So, but you would think with all those designations and with it being on a nature reserve that it should be a no-go area. It should be just don't touch it. Obviously, hydro schemes are great and important, but there's places where they just simply shouldn't go because they're just too sensitive, and this is one of them. So hopefully it will not be developed, and we won't see a scheme in there, I hope. Next slide, please. So this is just another gorge. I mean, there's several coming down off the hills, and they flow through the woodlands that we have on the reserve, and they're just really beautiful places and really special places. So that's just another one. Next slide, please. So this is Arianus wood. It's the largest wood on the reserve. It's kind of a semi-natural wood, and it's only still there because of the charcoal burning industry that was going on 1800s. This woodland, and the oaks in particular, was protected and kept growing and kept alive and not felled and cleared because of the charcoal burning industry. And there are nearly 100 charcoal burning platforms inside the wood. It's been surveyed, and there's pathways between them, and you don't walk very far through the wood before you come across a platform, and there's one every few hundred yards. So yeah, that's why this wood and many of the woodlands around the reserve are still there. Without that industry, that they probably would have been felled and cleared for livestock and for fuel, etc. So it's good that it's survived. The most natural remnants really are, as I say, inside these river gorges, because they were away from people. They were too steep for people to get into to fell them, too steep for browsing animals to get into to browse the trees. So what you see inside these river gorges, particularly the steeper sided ones, really are as close as a natural remnant as you're going to find, and we have some nice examples of that on Rahoy Hills. So next slide, please. So yeah, inside Arians Wood, it's a very rough, wild, steep wood. In my 25 years, I can honestly say I've only met half a dozen people in there. There's no paths in there. Well, there are a few if you know where to find them, and they're very old and they peter out here and there, and then you come across them again. But it's a very, very rough, steep-sided wood, south-facing, so it's very beautiful. Gets a lot of the sunshine. Yeah, and there's these rocky places and very explorable hidden places in there, which are great for wildlife, great for mosses and ferns, and yeah, so it's a lovely wood, but it is a very wild, rough going wood. Next slide, please. So that was just a quick kind of tour around the main habitats that we've got on the reserve, and as I say, the habitats is what, and that variety of habitats is what makes Rahoy very special. And obviously, all those different habitats and that diversity of habitats is mirrored in the flora and fauna that we have here. So we'll go back up to the mountain tops to start with and have a look at a few of the Arctic alpines. And this one is purple saxifrage, and it's lovely to see them in bloom in April up amongst the rocks on the hills in the spring. Very beautiful to see, and I love to see them in April. First sign of spring on the hills, really. So yeah, we did an Arctic alpine plant survey in the year 2000, and then that was a repeat of one done, I think, 20 years or so before that. And we are thinking of doing another one very soon to see how things are doing. But we do monitor a few key species annually. We'll have a look at a couple of those. If you'd like to change the slide, please. Well, this is just another, not such a rare one, but it's the moss campion, another one of the Arctic alpines. It's not one we monitor annually, but another nice one to see. Next, please, next slide. So this is one we do monitor annually. It's the hairy stone crop, or Sedum villosum. They grow on very bare sort of flushes on the tops of the hill. They bloom and come into flower in about mid-July. Lovely little flower, about 2 inches tall, if that. Sometimes you get, in a good year, you get lots and lots and lots of them. Great big, lovely show of them. In other years, there's very, very few, and we're not too sure what the reason is for the variation from year to year, whether it's to do with the weather, probably is, whether they like it a bit wetter or whether they like it very sunny and dry. I'm not too sure. They do tend to like the wetter flushes, so I would have thought the hot sunny weather isn't probably great for them. But yeah, it's a nice flower. Overall, they seem to be in decline. Numbers going back were like 3,000 for counts, and now we're getting 500-600 a year. So yeah, it's certainly declined, but it's hanging in there and not doing too bad. And they do have sometimes they do have a really good year, and then not such a good year. So we're just keeping an eye on it annually and see how it gets on. What I am interested in actually is what insects pollinate these mountain flowers. I'd love to find that out and see what sort of insects they depend on. That'd be quite interesting to find out. Okay, next slide, please. So this is another one of our very rare ones, the Arctic sandwort. And again, we've been monitoring this one annually since the mid-80s. And the warden before me, Donald Kennedy, he set up 5 permanent quadrats around the mountain, a 1.5 meters squared quadrat in different places on the hill, specifically to monitor this plant. And he would count how many plants were inside each quadrat and give each plant an actual coordinate within the quadrat, so he could monitor the movements of plants within the quadrats and see how they vary in size, how many seedlings produced from each plant, etc., all that kind of thing. But sadly, now all of the quadrats are completely empty. There's no Arctic sandwort in any of the 5 quadrats. But they are still on the hill. They do still grow, and they're still doing not too badly. And there are a few sort of strongholds around the mountain where they're hanging on in quite good numbers, but they are another Arctic alpine that has declined. I'll talk about the reasons a bit later on, but yeah, so that's a nice, lovely flower, nice to see in bloom, sort of May, June, clinging on to very bare, quite desolate slopes, but yeah, that's just the habitat that they tend to grow in. So, okay, next one, please. So obviously we've got a great deal of bird life up on the hills. I don't have a telephoto lens, so I don't have many bird images, but I've got a few. But we've got golden plover, which is what this bird is. Occasionally we've had ptarmigan nest on the 2 hills, but they're a wee bit too low for them. But we've had a few every now and again. We have a pair breed, which is nice. Got wheatear around the hills, which is the next slide, if you'd like to put that one up, please. That's a young wheatear. We've got pairs of wheatears around the hills. We've got stone chats, wind chats. I've talked about the birds we have around the Lochans, like the green-shanked dunlins, common sandpipers, things like that, and the common gulls, the red-throated divers. Obviously, the moorland, mainly, we've got meadow pipits, skylarks, snipe. So that's most of the hill birds. Obviously, next slide, please. We have our own pair of golden eagles. The reserve has its own pair, and the reserve is pretty much their territory. They do kind of wander outside of the reserve a wee bit, but mainly the reserve is their sort of territory. I'll be talking a bit more about golden eagles a bit later on. Next slide, please. And we do have sea eagles hanging around. They haven't yet set up home on the reserve, but I think it's only a matter of time. I'm surprised they haven't built a nest yet. I mean, particularly in the Arianus Wood, there's ideal trees for them in there, and I think it's only a matter of time before a pair does settle down and has a nest on the reserve. But they're always around, and you often see them about. So, yeah, it's nice to have the 2 different species. I don't have any images of woodland birds, but obviously the woodland birds are a huge part of our bird fauna. We've got some special woodland birds like redstart, wood warbler, tree pipit, great spotted woodpeckers, tree creepers, as well as all of our common species, So we've been monitoring them a lot as well over the years. We do a common bird census every 5 or 6 years. So we get a block of 5 years of data, and then we have a gap of 5, 10 years, and then we do another 5-year block We've got 3 blocks of 5 years of data, so we've got a lot of information to look at, and we've mapped all the territories for each species throughout the wood. It's a lot of work, but a great deal of information there. And I'll talk about how things are going a wee bit later on. But yeah, birds are a very big part of the reserve, and obviously my work that I do as well, monitoring wise. Next slide, please. And obviously, we've got a great deal of insect life on the reserve. I do a butterfly transect, and I also record dragonflies and damselflies on the transect. We've got 16 species of dragonflies and damselfly. This is the beautiful demoiselle, which is very striking. That's the male. Some years they have really good years, and there's some stretches of streams where they're absolutely crammed with these insects just fluttering around. It's quite a spectacle. Very beautiful insects. Yeah, so that's one of my favorites. Next one, please. That's the keeled skimmer, another quite a special dragonfly. It's got a very westerly distribution, which is this as has the beautiful demoiselle, which we just looked at. The distribution of these two dragonflies is very, very extreme west, particularly the keeled skimmer. So it's nice to have them here. Next one, please. That's just the common data, very abundant. They appear later on in the summer, and they go right into September, October, sometimes even early November if it's mild enough. It's a very common damselfly, dragonfly, sorry. Next one, please. Common hawker, probably our biggest dragonfly. They appear late July, and they're on the wing July, August, September into October. Quite a spectacular dragonfly. Next one, please. This is probably our rarest dragonfly. It's the northern emerald. Some years we don't see any, and then we get a year where we might get 1 or 2 sightings. So that's quite a special one. They appear kind of May time, May and into mid-June, around the edges of woodland. So yes, it's a nice one to find and see. I'm always pleased to see those ones. Next slide, please. So yeah, we've got some really great butterflies, and as I say, I monitor butterflies on the reserve, and it's a big part of my work. It takes up a lot of my time. From the end of April, I have to walk the transect once a week right through till the end of August or into early September. That's quite tricky here in the West. You know, you could see what sort of weather we get here when you were here. So trying to find that window of opportunity, that sunny spell where you have the ideal and required weather conditions to monitor butterflies is often very, very difficult to find here. So we do have a lot of missed weeks. It's just absolutely nothing we can do about it. But as long as we can get the week before and the week after, we can get an average for the missed weeks. So, but some years you get so many missed weeks that you can probably almost write off the year. If you get more missed weeks than weeks where you've actually managed to walk the transect, then the data isn't really that valid. But we just do it anyway, and we just get the data and gather it, and we have done since the mid-80s, and I think it's one of the longest running butterfly transects in the West Highlands. So we've got a huge amount of data going back. So we're keeping a good eye on all of our different species. And this one's a pearl-bordered fritillary, and they have quite a stronghold here in the West. They're a threatened species nationally, but here in the West they're doing quite well, and we have a good population on the reserve, and they like sunny, brackeny clearings in woodland, and they rely on the dog violet. That's the larval host plant. So it's one we have to really be careful with, because if you put a fence up around a wood, often your clearings can close up and the regen can encroach in the clearings, and therefore you're going to lose your butterfly. So we try to manage the habitat inside areas that have been fenced in the woodlands on the reserve, and try to keep the pearl-bordered fritillary clearings open. And so far that seems to be going okay. The numbers are not dropping, so yeah, would not like to see them decline. They're a lovely species to have around. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just the underside of a pearl-bordered fritillary, and we have the small pearl-bordered fritillary here as well. And the flight periods overlap. The pearl-bordered is on the wing from beginning of May through to about mid-June, and then from beginning of June or late May into beginning of June, the small pearl-bordered appears, and they're very, very similar, particularly when they're flying past you at high speed. Very, very difficult to separate the two. There's not, to be honest, not much difference in size, but the only way really to separate them properly is to be able to see that under the hind wing and underneath the wings. And if you look at this image, you can see the two white cells as well as the ring of pearls around the edge. We've got two white cells in the wing. That's the pearl-bordered fritillary. And then the next slide, if you don't mind putting that one up, that's a small pearl-bordered, and you can see it's got much more in the way of white cells in the hind wing, but its upper wings are virtually the same as the pearl-bordered fritillary. So the only way really to tell them apart is to look at the hind wing, although by the time the small pearl-bordered are on the wing, the pearl-bordered are starting to look a bit pale and worn. So, and then the small pearls are much fresher and brighter. So that's quite a good way to tell them apart as well. Okay, next slide, please. We have another fritillary on the reserve, the dark green fritillary. That's much, much bigger. Really beautiful summer butterfly. They appear late June, mid to late June, and they're on the wing till about mid-August. It's another nice one that we have. We have about 21 species of butterfly in the reserve. Next slide, please. So this is a grayling, and it's looking very conspicuous against the grass, but they are incredibly camouflaged in the habitat that you would normally see them on, which is quite rocky terrain. And we have them actually around the tops of the two hills, which is, I don't know if that's unusual, but mostly a kind of coastal species, I believe, liking the rocky places. But we have a population on and around the crags on the two hills quite high up. So they're nice to see when you're up on the hills. That's the grayling. Next slide, please. So this is the little checkered skipper. It was my holy grail species to find on Rahoy. Up until 10 years ago, it hadn't been seen on the reserve or in Morvern, and it was only found in very isolated small pockets within a short radius of Fort William. Very, very rare butterfly. And then in 2013, one was seen quite close to the reserve. So obviously I was very keen to try and find them. The next year they turned up on the reserve. And then since then, the population has absolutely exploded, and they are absolutely everywhere in Morvern now. And they've even been seen on the island of Mull. So it's a species that something has suited them, something's happened that has enabled them to have a very quick and very amazing population explosion and expansion. And now they're a very, very common butterfly here. See them everywhere. People are recording them in their gardens and just anywhere. So something, as I say, something suited them. And one person's theory was that because of the milder winters, more larvae are surviving, and also their flight period of June in some quite a few of them of the years recently has been quite good. So those two things are possibly why it's been doing a lot better. But it's just such a tiny little butterfly, and how it's managed to go the distances that it has. I mean, how did it get across the Sound of Mull to the Island of Mull? I don't know, but anyway, it's a good success story, and nice to have them here. Next slide, please. So just a few more pictures of the species we have, a butterfly species. This is the Scotch Argus, our most abundant species. Once it's on the wing, they appear in July, and they're a late summer butterfly. But once they're on the wing, they're absolutely, well, they're just in really good numbers. Usually, you see them all over the hills. It's difficult to drive through Morvern actually without, it's difficult to drive your car without having to try and avoid them crossing the roads, because there's just so many of them. But yeah, nice summer butterfly. Next slide, please. This is a large heath. We have the small heath as well, but this is the large heath, and it's quite a much scarcer butterfly, and it's a very much a moorland butterfly. And we have some nice populations, or on the reserve we have some communities of large heath up on the hills, and I monitor their numbers as well, and they're doing quite well. So yeah, we've got a lot of special butterflies on the reserve. Next one, please. So this is a purple hair streak, and it was discovered on the reserve in 2006, and it hadn't been seen in Morvern before or on the reserve. And it's an example of a species that is pushing further north. They're a sort of, this is right at the edge of the northern range, but they've now been seen on the other side of Loch Sunart on Ardnamurchan. So they are a species that are pushing north, and you find them only in the tops of oak trees, so they're very easy to miss, and they're very hard to monitor. You just have to look up into the tops of the oak trees, and you need to know their sort of characteristic way of flying. And if you're lucky, like I was that day, you can get quite close to them, particularly if you're walking along the top of a river gorge and you're sort of level with the tops of the oak trees. You get quite good views of them then. But yeah, this is probably along with the checkered skipper, this is our newest addition to the reserve, and it's nice to have them here. Okay, next one, please. Speckled wood, lovely butterfly. They have up to 3 generations a year. They appear in the spring, late March, April. That's actually my favourite butterfly, because it's just lovely to see them in the spring. The first butterflies you see, really, apart from the small tortoiseshell and the peacock that has overwintered. This is the first butterfly you'll see in the spring, this far north anyway. And then they have another generation mid-year, about June time, and then a third one late August, September, October. So lovely butterfly. Next one, please. And there's a huge array of different other insects. I've got a friend who his speciality is hoverflies, and he's recorded a lot of special hoverflies. I mean, there's so many different insects that needs to be discovered, really, and sort of looked at on the reserve. But we do monitor and record day flying moths. One or two people have done a little bit of moth trapping at night here, but not enough. So I'd love to get some moth traps going and get a good species list of moths for the reserve. But we've got a few special day flying moths. This is the emperor moth, and you come across these on the moorland in the spring and April. Really spectacular species. Next one, please. This is another amazingly spectacular day flying moth. It's the narrow bordered beehawk moth, and they charge around like rapid flying bees, really, really, very quick. But a stunning moth if you get to see them when they've alighted and landed, and a good close look at them. Quite rare, but we've got a few here, so it's nice to have them. But as I say, moths are a group that we need to get a bit more to grips with and hopefully build up a list of. I'm hoping to do some trapping at some point. Okay, next slide, please. Another day flying moth, the Argentine sable, which is a biodiversity action plan species, which means it's one that's endangered and they're trying to keep a closer eye on it. But we have a good population here. Yeah, lovely day flying moth to see. People would probably think it was a butterfly, but it's not. It's a moth. So yeah, just another one of our special species. Next one, please. So mammals, obviously we've got red deer, roe deer, pine marten. Don't think we've got any true, well, we won't have any true wildcats left. There's wildcats around, but there just won't be any true ones left anymore, unfortunately. We do have otter. This is an otter, obviously. They mainly frequent the coasts around Morvern, but they do visit the reserve, and we do see them in Loch Heriennis and up on the hill lochs. They go up to the hill lochs, particularly in the spring. I think they're mainly after the frogs. So it's nice to see them. And I have seen cubs on the reserve too, so that was quite special. And we've got fox as well and badger too. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is where we've got upland badgers. People tend to think the badgers are a woodland mammal and you get the big sets in the woods, but we have actually got a lot of badgers high up in the mountains. And the sets are in these rocky places around the bottom of the cliffs. And yeah, I've come across badgers trundling around up on the hills in the middle of the day. Nice encounters. They're a little bit different in that the sets aren't big. They're not. The numbers of badgers at the upland sets are quite small, and they do tend to move around. A local lady did a PhD on upland badgers, and she was using coloured pellets in food to try and track the movements of the badgers, and she was finding that where she fed badgers with these coloured pellets that were digestible and passed through the badger, they were turning up at other sets across the reserve. So they were spending some time in one set and then moving to another set 2 or 3 miles away. So they move around a lot. They're not stuck and they don't stay in one set. And as I say, the numbers of badgers at a particular set in the hills aren't particularly high. And also the coloring is a wee bit different. It's a bit sort of sandier, not so grey and black and white, but a bit more of a sandy colour, which is a bit unusual, but not that different in colour, but sometimes you notice it a wee bit. Anyway, that's where the upland is. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the sort of place you'll find the woodland badgers. Again, not a sort of typical badger set where it's a hole in a bank or lots of holes in a sandy bank or a soily bank. They tend to have sets in these big rocky places inside the wood, underneath the boulders, and that's where the woodland badgers are found. So yeah, nice mammal to have here. And they've increased in numbers hugely in the last 10 years. 10, 15 years ago, we hardly ever saw a badger, and local people hardly ever saw badgers. Now they are much more commonly seen. I encounter them a lot more. And the theory is that it's coincided with the change in law around the use of snares. It's now become much more difficult to use snares. The regulations has tightened up a great deal around their use. You have to check them a lot more regularly, and it's put off a lot of people from using them. And it's enabled the badger to increase because obviously snares can't differentiate between a fox and a badger, and they were unfortunately catching a lot of badgers. So that's the theory anyway, that the local badgers have increased because of now that the snares are not used, which is wonderful because they're just horrendous things to be used, to be honest. They should be banned altogether, but anyway. Okay, so we've just got a little video next, I think. It's of some badgers up on the reserve, just a nice little snippet. It's a family, a mother and two cubs. Okay, so we're now going to just talk about how the landscape is now and why it is that way. And the reason it's that way is because of these guys, the sheep. The sheep have been around on the hills in such huge numbers for such a long time that they've pretty much grazed it down to, well, the bare brown hills that you see these days. At one time in Morvern, there were 29,000 sheep here. So yeah, they've just, they've reduced the vegetation right down to the bare kind of short turf that you see there in this image. And that obviously, that and the high deer numbers that we have these days is why the hills are in the state that they're in at the moment. So there we are. That's kind of in a nutshell why the hills are in the state that they're in. Go on to the next slide, please. So yeah, just coming back to what I said earlier, because of all this overgrazing for such a long time, 2-3 centuries and decades of overgrazing, the hills are very, very bare. No, next to no trees, and very sparse vegetation. And the only trees you do come across are those ones that I spoke to you about earlier inside the river gorges on the edges of streams, which is quite a sad reality, but we're trying to address that. So that's how the hills are looking at the moment. Next slide, please. So yeah, you just come across little remnants and little isolated trees here and there, just reminding you of what used to be there. You just come across a rowan here and there, or just very, very sparse what's left, but just little reminders of what used to be there. Or you'd come across a peat hag and inside the peat hag you see all these birch roots and oak roots high up on the hill, telling you that once this was woodland. It was all cleared to make way for the huge sheep flocks. Next slide, please. So I don't know if you can make that out, but to the left, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a kind of a darker area of vegetation. That's right, and that's the blue arrows pointing that out, and that's a fenced exclusion up on the hill. It went in 1996, and it's like a little oasis. It's so different inside there than it is outside. You can see it partially there from a distance. All the dark colouring is heather, and there's a lot of trees in there too. So that shows you what could come back if we reduce the grazing. And we have removed the sheep. The sheep came off the reserve in 2017. working with Ardtornish, and they agreed to take them off. And Ardtornish, who partly own the reserve, the local landowners, have also removed sheep from pretty much all of their hill ground now, because they realise that biodiversity restoration is so important. So they've taken the sheep off, and they are bringing the deer numbers down as well. So the next slide, please. So that's a closer look at that exclosure. You can see the woodland that's grown and the heather too. And I like to talk about this a wee bit, because when I speak to people about having woodland back on the hill, they get a bit worried and say, oh, we're going to lose all the open hill. It's going to become thick woodland. We'll lose species like our golden plover. Where will the golden eagles be able to hunt? But actually, if you leave it to nature and you don't plant it, the trees will grow where they're going to grow, and they won't grow where they're not going to grow. And this is a great example of that. It's not wall-to-wall trees. So I think nature is the best manager of herself, and the trees will grow where they will, and they won't grow where they won't. And I can think of golden plover territories where there's no way trees will ever grow there. And there's a lot of open ground still in this exclosure for golden eagles to hunt in. So the concern about the uplands becoming completely overgrown and just woodland wouldn't happen. And this is a fantastic example of that. But the biodiversity in that exclosure compared to outside of it is so marked. I'll walk after being around it and walking up on the hills, coming down past it. The bird song just hits you. There's so many different species in there that you don't get on the open hill, and butterflies flying around and different plants and flower and things like that, and just shows you how much life there could be and should be on the hills, and hopefully will be again one day. Next slide, please. And that's taken from inside the exclosure, so you can see all the lovely trees and the heather. So that's what you should be walking through, really. That's what the hills should look like, not the bare hills that people see these days. So that exclosure went in 1996. This is now 2025, so almost 30 years. So if we really get on top of the deer numbers now and keep the sheep off, then in another 30 years time, 50 years time maybe, then the rest of this corrie, this glen, the reserve, could look like that, which is what we're looking for, really. Next one, please. So this is inside Arianus Wood, but it's outside of any of our exclosures. We have some fenced exclosures in and around the wood, but this is outside of an exclosure, and as you can see, it's looking pretty sad. It's kind of a dying wood. Those trees are all old. They're all going to fall down. There's absolutely no regen in there, no understory, no young trees coming through. So if it's just left like this and we don't intervene and try and help, then that wood will eventually just fall down and die. So that's how it looks outside of a fence. Next slide, please. This is inside a fence. You can see a lot of young trees coming through. The bog myrtle is the sort of golden coloured plant in front. That's all come through. A lot of birch regen, some oak regen, willows, and underneath the canopy there's a lot of rowan regen, which I think is on the next slide. Yeah, so inside the woodland we've got much more in the way of rowans coming through. Around the woodland edges we've got the birch. They're like a pioneering species. They're the first ones to appear around the edges of the wood, and they'll start to creep up the hill, the birch. But inside the woodland, underneath the trees, you get a lot of the rowan coming back, and ash as well. So Oak is a bit more difficult to get going. We get much less in the way of oak regen, but you do come across, suddenly you'll come across half a dozen oaks doing really, really well, coming away, but not in great numbers. So I think they would be a sort of slower species to come back, the oak, but generally the wood is coming back to life inside of the fenced exclosures, but we're trying to move away from that because it's an unnatural situation. The fences are unnatural, and eventually inside them it becomes a bit of a jungle, which is completely unnatural. And you lose, as I say, you lose butterfly species, you lose your flowering plants because it becomes too swamped, too dense, too overgrown. You don't have any animals moving through it to break it up in the autumn, browse it off in the autumn. So fences are an unnatural way to go about things. So we are trying to move away from fences, and that's where we are right now. We've got some old fences we want to that are literally falling down, and we don't want to replace them. We just want to remove them, and for the wood to naturally regenerate. But to do that, we need to keep on top of the deer numbers. So, next one, please. So there we are. That's our fences, starting 25, 30 years old. And they are now starting to fall down. So we obviously will have to either replace them or remove them. And we, after a lot of discussion and given it a lot of thought, we would like to remove them and not replace them for lots of reasons. They're very costly to replace. The carbon footprint to put a fence in is very high. You have this issue when they come to the end of their life. You have the issue of them falling down and then having to remove them. And they do create an unnatural environment inside of the fence. So although they work and they do help to get your wood back, they are not the ideal way to go. So as I said, we've decided that we will be removing these and working with the local estate to target culls around the wood so that numbers of deer remain low enough, hopefully, for the woodland to naturally regenerate. That's the plan. Okay, next slide, please. And the other issue with fences is if you fence off an area, it's not eliminating the issue of deer and the deer problem, because all you're doing is pushing the deer out of your woodlands onto other habitats. This is peatland, and peatland restoration came and looked at our peatland on the reserve and said it's absolutely perfect for restoration, ticks all the boxes, apart from that the deer density is too high, the deer pressure is too high on the vegetation. So if you fence a woodland and keep the deer out of the woodland, you're only pushing them onto other habitats. So it's not the answer. Next slide, please. So our hopes for its future, I've pretty much kind of said that already. It does hinge around the red deer, and I'm really keen to put across that we are not, we do not hate red deer. We don't want to see them eradicated. I find it very difficult. I see mother, hinds giving birth on the hill to lovely, beautiful calves, and I think they're a beautiful animal and they do have a place. And it's very difficult for me to recommend and agree with the culling of this species. But unfortunately, so much hinges on their numbers, and their numbers are so high at the moment that biodiversity is not able to recover, and nature is not able to restore itself if the numbers remain as high as they are. We do an annual foot count of red deer in Morvern, and that's what we've always done, a foot count. And we go out on a day and there's several counters on the hill. But this year we did a foot count, and then in 2 months after that we did a drone count. and the drone revealed twice the numbers that the foot count did. So that's kind of written off foot counts, to be honest, but it's also shown us that actually we have a lot more deer than we thought. So so we do need to bring them down, but in the long run, it's as much for the red deer as it is everything else, because they will also benefit. They will end up living in a much, much better, more suitable habitat for them too, in more sensible numbers. They are not an open hill animal. They are a woodland animal. So, and they struggle on the hills. You know, this winter weather up there is absolutely horrendous for them. And by the end of the winter, many of them are in a bad state because it's so exposed up there. So if we can bring the numbers down, the vegetation recovers, the habitat improves for everything, including the red deer. So that's our aim, and that the red deer absolutely belong here, and we want to see them in our woodlands in the future, but in the right numbers. Next slide, please. So if we want to change that image to the next slide, please. As I say, you know, it's a long road to get that back, but that's what we're aiming for, and that's what we'd like to see, much more in the way of woodland. It's what we need for the climate crisis. You know, we need more trees, but it's what Scotland should look like. The bare mountains that you see is not a true Scotland, really. It should be, the glens should be full of this. But it's going to take a long time, but we need to start now, and that's where we are, really. We're trying to work with landowners and trying to get them to see why we need to bring the numbers down and what we're doing it for. Okay, next one, please. So it's just an illustration of what we'd like to see in the future. The red deer in the woodlands, really. You know, it's just where they belong. They don't belong on the bare mountain sides. They really do struggle on the hills, and they should be in a nice woodland. So that's what we'd like to see in the future. Okay, next one, please. So since when the sheep came off in 2017, obviously that was a huge change. They'd been on the hill for decades and decades and decades. And very quickly, in the next 2 or 3 years following that removal, I did see the vegetation start to recover. And you can see here, heather, although it's very short, it is growing, and it's flowered, it's gone to seed, it's done its thing, it's gone through its cycle, whereas before it would have been all browsed off before it managed to do all this. So although it's slowly happening, and although the vegetation's growing to a short height, it is growing, it is happening. I am seeing the changes we need since the sheep came off, but it's still got a long way to go. But it was really encouraging to see that sudden, very quick difference in the flora on the mountains. Next one, please. That's just another example of heather coming through on bare places, grassy places. Heather's coming through. Next one, please. And I would often walk across just grassy, short turfed grassy areas with no flowering plants on it whatsoever. And once the sheep came off, this is what I was seeing: plants being able to do their thing, go through their cycle, grow, go into bloom, seed. So I just didn't see this when the sheep were on the hill. But now I'm seeing it. So that shows you the difference. And that obviously brings in a lot more insects, butterflies, insects for birds. So that shows you the biodiversity coming back. Next one, please. So I do have to talk about climate change, unfortunately. And I really am seeing the impacts of it in the last few years. going back to the Arctic alpines, they are really struggling, and all of our species are declining. And it's not that they need the cold, because people can grow Arctic alpines in their gardens at low altitude. But what the lack of cold in the winters now means that lowland species lower down on the hills are able to grow up higher, and they're out competing the Arctic alpines for space, just simply swamping their habitats. So that's what we're seeing on the two hills on on the reserve, Ben Eden and Ben Hua. The lowland species are encroaching on the upland and the higher places and swamping out the Arctic alpines. And Arctic alpines are a group that are nationally and internationally threatened because of climate change. There's not much we can do about it, really. We are looking at whether any browsing would help to reduce the lowland vegetation a wee bit, but that's very difficult to manage. Deer aren't the answer because they're not really a mountain species. We don't want sheep back up there, although we could perhaps have a flock we could manage and put on and take off. The ideal browser up there would probably be mountain hare. We did have mountain hares before, but they've all gone. But the concern with the mountain hare is that they wouldn't stay on the tops. They would come down and get into the woodland and impact on the tree regen. So it's all a bit tricky. But the best thing we can do for the Arctic alpines is, nature restoration on a huge landscape scale and globally, obviously, to try and stabilize the climate. But so, yeah, we'll just have to hope for the best. Okay, next one, please. So this is a golden eagle nest. And again, with regard to climate change, that nest is no longer there. It was washed off the mountain by a winter deluge. And that's been there for decades. And golden eagles aren't stupid. They do not nest under waterfalls. And it was such a horrendous fall of rain that the water was coming off the mountain where it never used to, and it simply washed the entire ledge, nest and all, off the mountain, and that's gone. And it happened to another nest as well. So severe weather is really impacting on our wildlife too. It's impacting on our bird species, the woodland summer migrant species in the woods on the reserve. They're coming back in the summer for what should be a bonanza of insects and a settled climate. And they're coming back to cold weather, wet weather, and a declining insect population. So bird numbers are dropping away. Again, it's very hard for me to see because I've wardened and watched these birds and monitored them for 25 years, and to see these declines in the last few years is very upsetting. So, I'm desperate to do what we can to get biodiversity back and try and stabilize the climate. But yeah, it's upsetting. Next slide, please. Yeah, a species that is declining because of climate change, the ptarmigan. What's happening is they change their plumage to white in the winter, but without the snow, they stick out like sore thumbs, and the golden eagles can pick them off so easily, whereas it should be a camouflage for them. So yeah, they are a declining species because they're not getting the snows that they used to. It's just another example. Next one, please. So this is just becoming much, much more of a rare sight in the Highlands, and particularly in the West Highlands. So yeah, that's, as I say, just don't see it so much. Milder winters, so it's just impacting on a lot of things. But it's not just the milder winters, it's the summers are wetter, windier, cooler. So yeah, the climate is all over the place, and it's really impacting on our wildlife at the moment. Next one, please. I took this picture, I don't know, 10 years ago in Arianus Wood, and it's not a cobweb. It's the larval strands, larval threads of caterpillars that live up in the treetops. And in June and July, when it's hot, they all come down on these threads, and you can walk through the wood and you're literally batting, or used to be batting them to one side. There used to be so much of that. And on the end of each strand was a juicy caterpillar for our summer visitors. I haven't seen that for a long time now. It's just become it's just not happening anymore. So our summer visitors are coming back for that bonanza of insect food in the woods and a stable, warm summer and spring to breed. And instead they're coming back to wet summers, wet springs, cold temperatures, windy. And the insects have obviously suffered for that as well. So the bird numbers are dropping away. So I know it sounds all a bit bleak, but unfortunately, that is the reality of it. You know, it really is impacting on our wildlife. Climate change isn't something that's just happening in the Arctic or in a wildfire in Australia. It's happening on our doorsteps, and it's very upsetting. Next one, please. But some species are benefiting, even if it is possibly in the short term. Like I mentioned this species earlier, because of warmer temperatures, they're pushing further north. This is the purple hair streak again, and it's a species that's pushed further north because of the milder weather. Butterfly conservation have said that Scottish butterflies at the moment are actually doing very, very well, but they said it's going to be a kind of a short-term thing. And, you know, as climate change changes even more, and the climate changes even more, but at the moment, because we're getting warmer weather, it's suiting the butterflies. So that one's the one that's doing okay. And it is, I know I'm kind of contradicting myself sometimes by saying we're having awful wet, cooler summers, which we are, but we're also having periodically amazingly hot, dry summers, which suits butterflies down to the ground. So it's a bit of a mix at the moment. You know, we get a summer and a spring of horrendous weather like we did this year, and then we'll possibly get next year. We might get an amazing dry, hot summer when the temperatures further south pushes further north. You know, those hot summers they get down there sometimes push a bit further north. So it's all a bit all over the place at the moment. And again, if you could change the slide, please. Again, the little checker skipper I mentioned earlier, I think that's to do with the weather changing as well, the reason for its expansion and it moving further afield. It seems to be because of the milder winters and its flight period being drier. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll just talk a wee bit about people and nature. We do have a reserve footpath. It was put in 2006. We tried to maintain it, but it's in need of quite a lot of work now because it's obviously been walked quite a lot, become more eroded, and it's now in need of some repair, quite a lot of major repair, really. But the trust is in a bit of a situation. They don't know whether there's enough footfall to justify spending the tens of thousands of pounds required to upgrade the paths. So that's where we are with the footpaths. We will probably be able to upgrade a part of it, but not all of it. But I think it'd be well worth upgrading the whole lot, even if they are unsure of the footfall, because if you put in a nice footpath, the footfall will increase. People will come, they'll enjoy their walk, they'll go away, tell other people about it, and they'll come and want to walk it. Whereas if at the moment they're coming here, having a very muddy, wet walk and going away and probably not wanting to come back, which is not what we want. And I think it's important to bring people to the reserve. It gives us the opportunity to engage with the public and with people and talk to them about the issues that nature is facing and what we're trying to do about it. So it's really important that we have the opportunity to do that. And I obviously personally, as the ranger, would like visitors to have a nice time and enjoy their walk. And so, yeah, I'm very hopeful that they can find some money to upgrade the footpath. Next one, please. So that's the footpath very, very quickly or very soon after it was put in. But now that has become just a completely muddy quagmire. It's just awful. So, yeah, absolutely, we desperately want to upgrade it, and it could be again a lovely path for people to walk, and I really hope it does happen. But next one, please. And part of my job was obviously to try to maintain the path as best I can. Stream crossings. This boulder was flat and level, but a spate and a bad spell of rain moved the boulder, so we had to level it up again so that it's safe for people to cross. There's always that aspect of my job that I have to do, try and keep maintain the footpath and maintain fences and things like that. So next one, please. Again, you can see this is the bridge at the end of the footpath, and as you can see, it was in need of some maintenance. So we replaced the bridge. We built a brand new bridge, and then a few months later, I'll show you what happened to the new bridge, and that's the next slide. Just literally a few weeks after the new bridge was put in, we had this horrendous rainfall in October, and it brought down all this timber from the gorge, and it just smashed into the bridge and smashed it. So that was a huge shame. So we've now got to look at rebuilding the bridge again, which, again, it's more money. It's I have to get people in to help me. It's not a very accessible place, so it's not easy maintaining all these things for the public, but I think it's well worth doing if we can. But it's difficult from the point of view of funds and fighting with the elements and trying to keep things looking nice. But now we've got to consider things like making a bridge stormproof, perhaps make it a wee bit higher and higher above the stream, things like that. So a lot to think about. Next one, please. So just to round off, the future of Rahoy really hinges on these animals, the red deer. So I'm just hopeful that we can get the landowners locally to all eventually come around and start to realise that biodiversity restoration is so important for not only nature but all of us and the rest of the world, and trying to stabilise the climate. It's what we can do. Everybody says, what can we do about the climate crisis? What we can do is what we can do on our own patch and locally, and that's do all we can for nature and try and restore it. And just one more slide. So that's me, a very rare image of me. And I'd just like to say that the warden who stands there, maybe 25, 30, 40 years from me, I hope that they are overlooking the hillside with a lot more in the way of woodland on it and biodiversity and birds flying around and looking in much better health, and that would be fantastic, and that's what I'm desperately hoping for and working towards with my colleagues. And that's the end of my talk.
Well done.
Sorry, I was trying to get myself unmuted. Oh, thank you very much, Steve. That was a really fascinating run through of your job, the estate, and what's happening there. And I'm just, I mean, before I open it up to questions, I want to ask how many people, what sort of team of volunteers or paid people do you have helping you do all this monitoring work that you're clearly doing on the ground?
monitoring wise, it's just myself. I don't have any help with that. I do have help with the practical side of things, like if a big tree comes down on a fence, then I'll need a team to help me with that, or to carry materials in, or if there's path work to do, again, just more people to carry materials. So, but monitoring wise, it's just myself.
Right. So you don't. So Scottish Wildlife Trust volunteers aren't coming in on a regular basis or an occasional basis to support you with that sort of stuff.
No, we for a few years we had a small team of volunteers based in Inverness, and they would go to all the reserves in the north, including Rahoy. When I say the north, I mean everything north of the Great Glen. And so they would come to Rahoy 2-3 times a year for a week at a time. And whilst they were here, that as well as helping with practical stuff, they wanted and would like to have come out with me to learn some of the monitoring that I do. So they did help a wee bit with that then, but it was more for their experience, really. So they gain a bit more experience.
But that stopped happening.
Yeah, I mean, since Brexit, because the volunteers we were getting were coming from abroad for work experience here, and it's stopped since then. But we're hoping to get it going again, but probably using more local people or people from this country. It's just a bit of a hiccup at the moment since Brexit, but we're hoping to get it going again.
Yeah. Well, my hat comes off to you for the amount of work you're doing or have been doing to try and just maintain and develop the reserve. But I should open it up to anyone else, the others, if you want to unmute your microphones, if you'd like to ask Steve a question. I'm only on a small iPad, so I can't see people's hands going up. So I think just maybe speak out. Is there anything they'd like to ask or comment on for what Steve said?
I'd just like to say I thought the slides were absolutely fantastic, especially as we were there in the summer in the pouring rain much of the time. Absolutely wonderful. And I can't wait to go back and see as the trees develop. Just really good to see all those wonderful images.
Yeah,
especially the dragonflies and we did see a beautiful demoiselle, but we didn't see any of the others. It was just wonderful.
Yeah, it'd be nice if you can come back and for it to be better weather. So, yeah. I've actually got a question for your group, actually, unless there's any more questions, but I'll ask that at the end.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Sheila speaking.
Hello, Sheila.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can, yes.
Why I'm saying it is just for your information, Audrey. I've been throughout the talk. I've enjoyed it very much. Beautiful talk. For some reason or other, I've faded off the gallery and my screen's telling me I'm not signed in properly. I'll maybe get it right next time.
No, it seems fine. You're fine from this end. I can see you and hear you clearly. So
can you?
Yeah.
I don't have it on my end. My end. Oh, it tells me that I'm talking, but it tells me to sign in. So
well.
I'm there. Okay. I'll get it right next time.
Okay.
Oh, can I ask something?
Yeah, carry on.
So that was quite interesting that you got the sheep taken off the land about 7 years ago, and now a lot of the vegetation is regenerating. So, I mean, does that suggest that the sheep were really more of the problem than the deer are now?
Certainly, they've been the biggest problem and the main problem because they were here in such huge numbers, but it's now that it's also the deer as well. It's not just the sheep, but it'll be it's made a huge change, and it was a great thing to happen. Obviously, we're very aware of people's ways of life. We know that there are shepherds up around here. They were worried about when the sheep came off the hill about their jobs and their way of life and the farming side of the estate. So we don't want because I've heard it said that some people see conservation and rewilding as the next Highland clearance, and that's an awful thing to have people think of it as. We don't want them to see it as that at all. Farming won't end. All of the sheep, although they've come off the hill, they're not all gone. They're in lowland fields and better, more suitable places for them. And actually, we might still be using some of the sheep as a grazing tool to maintain habitat. So farming won't come to an end. It's just a change. There'll be changes to how it's done. Same with the cows. The estate are looking to change their breed to have a smaller breed that is suitable to put in the woodland and on the hill to again use as a habitat managing tool. So it's just about change. It's not about an end to people's ways of life. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to get rid of people and just have nature move back in. We want people to be very much a part of the biodiversity restoration. So that's hugely important to us. But from the point of view of your question, it's, the sheep were a massive, massive reason for the hills to be in the bad way that they are. But for sure, unfortunately, they will not fully recover with the deer numbers at the densities that they are at the moment.
More deer fetches to help.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you're getting different cattle in as well, because I know like SWT have been using cattle and sheep for for quite a while, and ponies as well, do they?
Yeah, I believe so in some places. Yeah, I mean, having zero grazing is completely not right. What I said about putting the woodland fences up, it's completely unnatural, and you just create this overgrown jungle that doesn't, all the autumn growth or the late summer growth just falls down, doesn't get broken up or browsed off. So you completely swamp out your chance of having any flowering species, and therefore you lose your butterflies as well. So and any chance for any more tree regen, so you do need some browsing animals and browsing animals moving around to make it a better habitat.
Yeah,
I was wondering if you'd be in favour, therefore, of reintroducing predators for the deer. I mean, I know it's very tricky, but
I am 100% behind the reintroduction of wolves. 100%. I'd just be able to retire and put my feet up and let the wolves do my job. They would do it. They would sort it out and balance everything out. And there's been examples of that elsewhere in the world, and it would happen here if given the chance. I really do find it difficult to have to recommend the shooting of any animal. I don't like that at all. I'd be much happier if it was a natural predator prey thing going on, but I can't ever see wolves coming back, unfortunately. They've come back into parts of Europe, and it's worked really, really well. Farmers have realized they can live alongside wolves. They just need the wolf hounds around the flocks, and if you educate people and talk to them, you can get them to realize that yes, they're not going to run off with your baby in the middle of the night, and things like that. It's all myth and fairy tales, and you can live with these big predators and live alongside nature.
The other predator they've talked about bringing back is the lynx. Would that do something for your deer numbers as well, without there being threat on the sheep population?
The lynx probably wouldn't do much with the red deer. They would probably more target the roe deer, the smaller roe deer, and we don't have many roe deer here, so I don't think lynx are the answer. But the likelihood of a lynx reintroduction is looking much more much more of a chance of happening and becoming reality than the wolf reintroduction.
As well think, Steve, that maybe if more landowners were encouraged to remove massive deer fences and allow the deers a freer rein to actually move around, you wouldn't get such condensed browsing.
It is an issue for sure. You're right. I mean, the local estate, our Tornish, have just planned a huge deer fence, joining up other deer fences, and it will exclude deer from a massive area, but it's only going to push them out.
Yeah.
So
it just pushes them into somebody else's area that's going to destroy their environment.
Exactly. I mean, deer control and reducing deer numbers has to be on a landscape scale across lots of different landowners. If our local estate, which they are doing, they are going to bring numbers right down, but without all the other landowners round about doing it, it's not really going to work because the estate here isn't fenced off. So it has to be a collaborative agreement on a big scale, really.
And is there work going on towards that in the Morvern Peninsula?
There is. There is a Morvern Deer Management Group, and it's made up of all the, I don't know how many, 6, 8 different landowners. And they meet twice a year to discuss, cull targets and figures and that and whatnot. And more, it's the discussions are coming around to not so much cull targets, but more the impacts on vegetation targets. So biodiversity restoration is certainly being spoken about much more, whereas a few years ago, if you dared to mention that at a deer group meeting, they would all it would be a bit hostile and not very receptive. And but yeah, it's absolutely the tone is changing, and people are starting to realize that we're going to have to do this, and it's for such a bigger picture. It's not just about nature restoration. It's about the climate crisis, and it's a global thing.
I also think that the fact that a lot of these landowners can no longer command massive fees for allowing people to shoot on their land is also sort of helping in one respect to narrow their view down a little bit to make them think.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I would love to see. I'm all in favour of area safaris, but not with guns, with cameras. That way you maintain your wildlife, you see it, you can photograph it, you can get your shot, but it's there to shoot again the next day.
Yeah, I mean, again, with regard to deer stalking and deer stalkers and the sporting side of things, we are obviously aware of, again, there are people who have their jobs and their way of life as a stalker, and so we are concerned for them. We're not just brushing them aside, but again, it's not an end to stalking. In fact, it's far from that. But it will be a change. It will become more conservation stalking than sports stalking. And if I was a hunter, I think I would much prefer a much more difficult hunt in more difficult terrain, woodland habitat, a true hunt, than an easy walk on the hill with point your gun outside your Land Rover window and just shoot a deer, because there's so many of them and it's so easy to see them.
Yeah.
Most of them couldn't hit a barn door at 10 paces anyway.
No, it's just a change. Again, it's not an end, it's a change.
Do you happen to know if the local estates actually feed the deer?
They don't feed them now. Well, I think there's a couple of estates in Morvern that does, yeah. But our local estate, our Tornish estate doesn't, no.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's not bad. It was only a couple out of, the whole area.
Yeah.
Because that's, yeah. Very good.
Has anyone else got a question for Steve, or something they might like to say about his talk? Steve, you had a question for us.
Yeah, one of the things I didn't really hit on was that the Arctic alpines are doing very well. They're where they are around the basalt crags because of the basalt, and it's a very crumbly rock. And I've been told that the soils around these crags is called base rich. but I've not come across anybody who can actually explain what that really means. What does base rich mean? Because I don't want to talk about it in future talks without knowing what I'm talking about. Does anybody know what base rich means?
Does it not just
For
mean
you, Mary? You're on mute, Mary.
You're muted, Mary.
I think it refers to the pH value, that it's a high pH.
It's above 7.
It's above 7, yes.
Yeah, whereas acid would be below 7.
So it's the opposite of acid.
Okay.
so it's alkaline?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. I didn't know that.
The thing is, it's aluminium sensitivity a lot, because at varying pHs, different elements come into they're dissolved and able to be taken up. And I think I'm no chemist at all, but I think at a higher pH you don't get so many aluminium ions, which are poisonous to a great many plants.
Okay. So
giving more nutrients.
Okay. So how does the basalt? How does that make the soil more base rich? Is it just because it's a crumbly rock?
No, it's just rich in itself. It's got a lot of hornblende in it, which is an alkaline mineral.
Okay.
Breaks down feature soil.
Okay. Thank you. Right.
Okay. Has anyone got any more questions?
Well, just left for me to thank you very much for the talk, Steve. It was really interesting, and hopefully we might get back again as a botany group or as individuals to visit more of the estate in the future and see the change in the woodland.
Yeah, and if you do come back, obviously get in touch, or even if you come back as an individual, it'll be nice to get in touch. It's always nice to see people and talk to people. So I don't. Most of my job is lone working and living, working on my own. So I do like the opportunity to speak to people.
Oh, thank you very much for that, and thanks for your time tonight. It was really, you've obviously taken a lot of time putting together the presentation, and it was really, really enjoyable. As Mary said, all the beautiful slides.
Thank you for having me.